So what I would like to talk about today is how, through a lifetime of experience, I have watched over and over the exasperation of poor people turn into social turmoil and then being misinterpreted or misunderstood, and it's led to all kinds of misadventures that have still have us with ghettos and poverty at the same level it was when I was growing up. I grew up in a mixed race area. The hub for where we were living was North New Jersey. So when the uprisings took place in the end of the 60s, that was a seminal experience in my life. Not just watching places I was familiar with go up in flames and having a National Guard come in from the Midwest that looked like an occupation and felt like an occupation force. What really stunned me as a young person was the disconnect between what was happening on the ground and the way the media was portraying. First of all, they didn't call them uprisings or insurrections or anything that had to do with people taking control of the situation and just being so frustrated that they had to resort to violence to get their word out and get some attention for what was going on in those places. The media labeled them as race riots. Now, why or how would a race riot? This is a very demeaning term. It means that these people are just crazy. It was portrayed as chaos. All you saw was on the media and the news was people looting stores, going crazy, screaming, yelling at the police, and there was no interviewing of anybody who lived in that neighborhood, like the Black Panthers, who were trying to do community programs at the time. So that experience stayed with me all my life, and I have written about it extensively. The first novel I ever wrote was called Area, and it was about 3 young people growing up at the time of the uprisings in Newark. Just 3 people. What was important to me is how people react to an event like that in their lives. Not some sociological report, not some statistics on what poverty is and why this happened. How does this actually affect people living in these places? That's what's usually missing. Now, at the end of the uprisings, Johnson was president, and he commissioned something called the Kerner Commission to do a report on why the uprisings, or what they called riots, took place. Now, he concluded that it was systemic racism and poverty, which was not very popular and not what Johnson wanted. But as a result of that, you had policies that were focused on what they called community action programs. Community action programs were mandated to be run by the people in those communities, which would have been black and brown people living in those places, and starting programs from the ground up for the people who were living in those communities so that they would have an economy of their own, they would have social services of their own, and they would be delivered by people in the community. So this was controversial to the extent that you would have to trust black and brown people to be able to run their own programs and to do their own thing and do it successfully. And you would also have to give them a little leeway and time to make mistakes. And none of this was possible because the mandate that Johnson set out was to find an answer to why we were having uprisings or riots. And because white America has such an intense fear, it's almost primal, of black people, especially black males, that the fastest way and the most sure way to ensure that there wouldn't be any more insurrections or riots was to criminalize poverty. So after Johnson's program came in, you had Nixon and then you had Reagan. Nixon brought in the war on crime, and Reagan brought in the war on poverty. And I started to write articles about this. the unintended consequences of mass incarceration, which was to create a whole new generation of black and Hispanics who have completely no interest in a relationship with white society at all. They have their own language, they have their own music, they call themselves niggas, which is N-I-G-G-A-S, not niggers, N-I-G-G-E-R-S. This was explained to me by a young brother I was a roommate with. And in the past, like the 50s and 60s, I read a review of a novel by a young woman who just wrote a book about two twins who were both light-skinned, and one adapted to being white. And this was in the 50s and 60s, and she did very successfully in life, at least overtly. Whatever conditions she went through psychologically and emotionally is what the writer got into. But there is no longer that thing that if you become white, you're going to be successful in America. These kids don't buy it for good reason. And they've adapted this whole persona way of being that just says, F you, establishment, we're going to do our own thing. So now how do you maintain a democracy when you've got a large part of your population that wants no part of what you're offering and is quite willing to go to jail or do whatever else they have to do what they need to do? So that was one article I wrote, and that was not published by anybody. So the next one I wrote was how poverty became a degenerate American enterprise. And I trace what I started to talk about here, which is how the benign social programs, or benignly intentioned social programs of the Great Society were weaponized to criminalize and incarcerate poor people, because that's an easier way to deal with the problem than the painstaking work of community building and these various things. But we have to build a movement on this, and we have to use it to become activists. We have to take our communities back from the politicians who don't really live here. They're all millionaires. You take Congress and the Senate. Why would any of them do anything for poor people when none of them have ever experienced it or even know intimately somebody who is poor? That's wishful thinking. What we have to do is start from the ground up and use things like an op-ed like this to further our activism. Because if we don't, we're going to have a civil war in this country. And I say that because if Mr. Trump didn't get distracted by the pandemic, if you recall, right before that, he was talking about how there was all this homeless problems in blue states, democratic states, and he was going to go in there with the federal government and federal troops and start cleaning up all of the homeless enclaves and et cetera, et cetera. Now, if you blame poverty on the blue states and the Democrats, when conservatives and liberals are equally as responsible for it, because none of them are black, none of them are brown. I'm talking about 20 years ago when all this started. And even now, there are not enough people representing poor people. So what you're going to do is end up with a class war and a civil war in this country if we don't change things very quickly. Today at this first ever Commission on Global Homelessness. It is my honor to be representing those who are not usually invited to these kinds of events. Of course, I am talking about the homeless and the displaced. I too have experienced homelessness. I also work with others who have, as well as with private and public agencies that offer services to the poor and homeless. The main argument I will make today, based on my experience and knowledge, is for us to examine the changing social values and economic practices that are taking place in wealthy nations like the United States, and which are undermining their democratic goal of shared prosperity, leading to dramatic spikes in income inequality, poverty, homelessness, and social unrest. Persons displaced from their homes, be it from economic and/or political factors, is a global humanitarian crisis
If we do not address this crisis wherever we are living right now, this situation will conflate into a global catastrophe that will inevitably instigate radical political misadventures and worldwide conflagrations. Thank you for listening.